There was an article written today by Ari Berman of Mother Jones about voter suppression and how it handed Trump the state of Michigan in the 2016 election. I want to break this article down because it might be one of the most important articles you ever read regarding the organized assault on voting rights going on in America right now. There have been a lot of good articles written about voter suppression over the past few years, but the issue itself remains elusive. There aren't many people talking about it, and even fewer people, even on the left, thinks it played a role in Trump's victory. Most people are of the belief that Trump won fair and square as a result of better turnout. Even in articles written about the plummet in non-white voting in 2016, it's usually framed as a turnout issue, not as an issue of suppression. It's blamed on Hillary Clinton being a bad candidate, not voter ID laws that have been passed in numerous states since 2010. The fact that the 2016 election was the first presidential contest in more than 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act is never brought up as a potential explanation for what happened to black and brown turnout, which decided the election. When you look at the evidence, you see a very different story. You see that Trump won not because whites were simply more energized and they liked his populist message and hated Clinton. Some of that might be true, but that's not why he won. He won because of voter suppression. He won because a large portion of black, brown, and young people who propelled Obama to victory in 2008 and 2016 were victims of perhaps the greatest assault on voting rights and therefore American democracy since the Civil Rights Movement. Articles like this are why I make that claim. So the article begins with a story about a 37-year-old black woman named Andrea Anthony and how she wasn't able to vote because of a new voter ID law in Wisconsin that stated that even if you were registered to vote at your current address, so you haven't moved or anything like that, you're at your current address and you're registered at that address, you still had to provide current documentation in order to cast a ballot. So a current driver's license, and the one she had was expired. Her driver's license in the article, it's revealed that her license was expired. So you have to have a current driver's license, a current passport, or a current state or military ID. So since she had none of those, she was given a provisional ballot. And anybody that's done research on voting and the voting process knows that provisional ballots are very sketchy. Okay, in terms of whether or not they're counted as being part of the official tally at the end. But here's the catch. Her provisional ballot would only be counted if she went to the DMV and got a current ID and go to the city's clerk office to confirm her vote. She had 72 hours to do all of this with a full-time job and 7 children to look after. So needless to say, what do you think happened? She didn't vote. Anthony also had a 19-year-old daughter and a 21-year-old nephew who were of voting age themselves for the first time in 2016, and they wanted to vote and would have voted, but knew their votes wouldn't count because of the new voter ID law and the fact that they misplaced their licenses. Both were planning to vote for Clinton. Voter suppression isn't a potential threat to the left and American democracy in the future. It's not some illusionary, vague, ghost-like threat that might happen one day. No, it's already happening. It's happened actually numerous times already in previous elections. It's just that the issue of voter suppression itself is just not taken seriously. You see articles written about it. You see these studies done about it. You look at the long list of ways they suppress the vote. It's not even just voter ID law. This article is focusing purely on, for the most part, purely on voter ID laws. But this is just one of numerous ways that they have at their disposal to stifle the vote, to suppress the vote. And they usually do this against particular groups of people who have a certain either political ideology or certain groups of people who vote a certain way. So let me continue. So we are currently living in the era of voter suppression. Let me repeat that. We are currently living in the era of voter suppression. We are living in Jim Crow 2.0, and it's time we started acting like it. So let me continue reading this. The article says, quote, on election night, Anthony was shocked to see Trump carry Wisconsin by nearly 23,000 votes. The state, which ranked second in the nation in voter participation in 2008 and 2012, saw its lowest turnout since the year 2000. More than half of the state's decline in turnout occurred in Milwaukee, which Clinton carried by a 77-18 margin, but where almost 41,000 fewer people voted in 2016 than in 2012. Turnout fell only slightly. Check this out. Turnout fell only slightly in white middle-class areas of the city, but plunged in black ones. Okay, so Trump carried the state by nearly 23,000 votes, but there was a 41,000 vote drop-off in one of the blackest areas of the state, and the one of the, obviously, since it's the blackest area, one of the blackest areas of the state, obviously Clinton carried it 77-18. Okay, so that's very important information in the larger context of the story. In Anthony's old district, now I'm continuing, in Anthony's old district, where aging houses on quiet tree-lined streets are interspersed with boarded-up buildings and vacant lots, turnout dropped by 23% from 2012. 23%. This is where Clinton lost the state, and with it, the larger narrative about the election, end quote. So let me stop there. So Trump, like I said, I'm just going to reiterate a few things. So Trump won the state by anywhere between 22,000 and 28,000 votes, depending on which numbers you're looking at. But 41,000 fewer people voted in 2016 versus 2012, all coming from majority black Clinton-strong areas of the state. Again, you'll have people who say things like, well, that's just a turnout issue. People weren't motivated to vote for Clinton. You know, as you'll see from the rest of the article, though, that simply cannot be assumed as the explanation any longer. And that is an assumption. It's not necessarily a fact, and it's important that I point that out. Ari Berman shows the dismissiveness of having a dialogue around voter suppression in the article itself. He says, quote, Clinton's stunning loss in Wisconsin was blamed on her failure to campaign in the state, and the depressed turnout was attributed to a lack of enthusiasm for either candidate. And then there's another quote here from someone he's quoting in the article, named Sabrina Tavernese, or however you pronounce her last name. She says, quote, perhaps the biggest drags on voter turnout in Milwaukee, as in the rest of the country, were the candidates themselves, end quote. Sabrina Tavernese of the New York Times wrote in a post-election dispatch that typified this line of analysis. And then she continues, to some, it was like having to choose between broccoli and liver, end quote. Then Ari Berman continues, the impact of Wisconsin's voter ID law received almost no attention. When it did, it was often dismissive. 2 days after the election, Talking Points Memo ran a piece by University of California Irvine law professor Rick Hansen under the headline, quote, Democrats blame, quote unquote, voter suppression for Clinton's loss at their peril, end quote. That was the headline. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker said it was, quote, a load of crap. Of course he would. He's one of the architects of voter suppression, one of the people pushing voter suppression laws in the state of Wisconsin. Of course he denied that. So he called it a load of crap to claim that the voter ID law had led to lower turnout. So they do things like this. They play stupid, a lot of these Republicans. They pass these laws that they know are going to depress the vote. They know that they're going to suppress the vote because they put more impediments in the way of people being able to vote. And they know that even if they get, they're not even expecting to get 10, 20%. They're not expecting that large of an impact. But even if they're in a battleground state, even if they can get a small percentage of the people who vote in that state to be affected by the law, that could tip the state in their favor, in the favor of the candidate that they want to win. You don't need to, when it comes to a battleground state where the victor is winning by a mere 23,000 votes, you really don't need to affect a large percentage of people. And really, you don't want to do that, because if you affect a large percentage of people, then that will set off alarms. And it'll be a lot harder to argue that the voter ID law is the reason that Trump won. So you affect as small of a number of people as you could possibly affect, so that it's not really recognized, and that Trump isn't winning by some huge, red flag type of percentage. He's winning by a small percentage. He's winning by 1 or 2%. So that's what they're aiming for. They're aiming to affect just a few people. They use these voter suppression tactics to affect just a few people, but that goes a long way. So continuing, when Clinton in an interview with New York Magazine said her loss was, quote, aided and abetted by the suppression of the vote, particularly in Wisconsin, the Washington Examiner responded, quote, Hillary Clinton blames voter suppression for losing a state she didn't visit once during the election, end quote. As the months went on, pundits on the right and left turned Clinton's loss into a case study for her campaign's incompetence and the Democratic Party's broader abandonment of the white working class. Voter suppression efforts were practically ignored when they weren't mocked. So I want to break this down as well. Some of those complaints against Hillary Clinton were valid. She didn't do as much campaigning in certain battleground states, like Wisconsin, that she should have. But at the same time, when you look at the number of people whose votes were affected by voter ID, you kind of see that that's still not really an excuse for why she lost. We can blame her incompetence, her campaign's incompetence in certain areas as contributing factors, but to say that that's the only reason, to say that's the entire reason she lost because she didn't campaign there, is to ignore voter suppression. Because there is evidence that voter suppression actually played a bigger role in why she lost the state of Wisconsin, as opposed to simply her not campaigning there. So I just want to add that. So continuing, stories like Anthony's went largely unreported. An analysis by Media Matters for America found that only 8.9% of TV news segments on voting rights from July of 2016 to July of 2017, quote, discussed the impact voter suppression laws had on the 2016 election, while more than 70%, quote, were about Trump's false claims of voter fraud and non-citizen voting, end quote. So 70% went to Trump's claims about voter fraud and people who weren't citizens voting. Only 8.9% actually went to voting rights itself in discussions about voter suppression. So again, you see the media focusing on Trump's talking points and Trump's ways of bogarting the argument and sort of confusing the argument and muddying the waters, instead of actually focusing on what actually happened and the reason he might have won some of these states. That's the media for you. That's kind of typical. During the 2016 campaign, there were 25 presidential debates, but not a single question about voter suppression. 25 presidential debates and not a single question about voter suppression. Okay, and honestly, there was very little discussion about a lot of topics. There was very little discussion about criminal justice issues. There was very little discussion about all sorts of things, like especially in the general election. I think the primaries had a little bit more of a nuanced, a little bit more of a nuanced discussion, at least maybe on the Democratic side. But when the general election debates came around, no, they were just stuff that were just never even brought up. The media has spent countless hours into interviewing Trump voters, but almost no time reporting on disenfranchised voters like Anthony. Many in the media have largely ignored the issue of voter suppression, and it bothers me to say that even on the left, I've found that many give lip service to issues around voter suppression, but I don't really hear anyone saying it tipped the election to Trump. Maybe just because some people don't believe it, but most people push the line of thought that says Trump won simply because people were more energized and his message was populist and Hillary Clinton was corrupt. Understand it's not because there is a lack of evidence proving voter suppression. Also understand that the accepted version of 2016 is only an idea or concept of why Trump won, even though it is often stated as a proven fact when it is not. Continuing with the article, it says, 3 years after Wisconsin passed its voter ID law in 2011, a federal judge blocked it, noting that 9% of all registered voters did not have the required forms of ID. Black voters were about 50% likelier than whites to lack these IDs because they were less likely to drive or to be able to afford the documents required to get a current ID, and more likely to have moved from out of state. There is, of course, no one thing that swung the election. Clinton's failings, James Comey's 11th hour letter, Russian interference, fake news, sexism, racism, and a struggling economy in key swing states all contributed to Trump's victory. We will never be able to assign exact proportions to all of the factors at play, but a year later, interviews with voters, organizers, and election officials revealed that in Wisconsin and beyond, voter suppression played a much larger role than is commonly understood, end quote. Let me stop right there because I go slightly further than Ari here. While I do think we can say certain things like Clinton's failing as a candidate and James Comey's letter that came out a week before the election and sexism and racism, we can say all of those things might have collectively played a role, but you can't compare any of those with voter suppression as a determining factor. Why? Because with voter suppression, we have the numbers. It's hard, if not impossible, to ascertain how impactful fake news was or Clinton being a bad candidate because those are too subjective. And you have people who are ready to vote for Clinton despite the fake news against her, the sexism she faced, and her being under criminal investigation for a large portion of her campaign. What we do know is how many people were impacted by voter ID laws. And I happen to think estimations we have are conservative. We do know about Crosscheck, which was exposed by investigative journalist Greg Palast, which me and Anoa Chunga of the Progressive Army have had discussions about several times in the past. I believe there is more than enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that voter suppression was the most important factor in the outcome of the 2016 election. Now, continuing, the article says, quote, Republicans said the ID law was necessary to stop voter fraud, blaming alleged improprieties at the polls in Milwaukee for narrow losses in the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections. But when the measure was challenged in court, understand, when the measure was challenged in court, the state couldn't present a single case of voter impersonation that the law would have stopped. Judge Lynn Alderman wrote in a 2014 decision when he struck down the law, he said, quote, it is absolutely clear that the law will prevent more legitimate votes from being cast than fraudulent votes. So this was a decision that a judge came to. He said this voter ID law is going to suppress the vote, and not so many words. Alderman's ruling was overturned by a conservative appeals court panel, which called Wisconsin's law, quote, materially identical to a voter ID law in Indiana, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2008, even though Wisconsin's law was much stricter. The panel said the state had, quote, revised the procedures to make it easier for voters to obtain a voter ID, which reduced, quote, the likelihood of irreparable injury, end quote, because I'm sure that was one of the stipulations for why the law couldn't be allowed. But this conservative appeals court had a different opinion. But the law was allowed to stand for the 2016 election. Many more rounds Many more rounds of legal procedures ensued, but the law was allowed to stand for the 2016 election. After the election, registered voters in Milwaukee County and Madison's Dane County were surveyed about why they didn't cast a ballot. 11% of those cited, 11% cited the voter ID law and said they didn't have an acceptable ID. Of those, more than half said the law was, quote, the main reason they didn't vote. According to the study's author, University of Wisconsin-Madison political scientist Kenneth Mayer, that findings implies that between 12,000 and 23,000 registered voters in Madison and Milwaukee, collectively as many as 45,000 statewide, were deterred from voting because of the ID law. Quote, we have heard evidence there were tens of thousands of people who were unable to vote because of the voter ID law. Again, Trump won Wisconsin by anywhere between 22,000 and 28,000 votes, depending on which numbers you're looking at. 45,000 people statewide, coming from strong Democratic territories, said they didn't vote or were unable to vote because of the ID law. Let that just sink in for a second. The scope of this suppression, the scope of this really what amounts to a constitutional violation, or at least it should, but we know how that works. So let me stop here with the article and add my 2 cents. You had a judge in 2014, just to recap, strike down the 2011 voter ID law because he said it would suppress the vote, as I mentioned earlier. He didn't use that phrasing, but if you say it'll prevent legitimate votes from being cast, you're essentially calling it voter suppression without actually saying it. Then you had the conservatives in the judicial system, many of whom helped to maintain elements of white supremacy in the criminal and justice system, by the way. They come in and they challenged the 2014 ruling, which allowed for a law that a judge said was, quote, absolutely clear the voter ID law would suppress the vote to stand for the 2016 election. That is absolutely insane. A judge said this law would suppress the vote, and it stayed on the books anyway. And guess what it did? It suppressed the damned vote and likely gave Trump Wisconsin. This is just one state I'm talking about today with a voter ID law. Laws like this have been passed and continue to get passed all over the country. Republican-controlled state houses have already passed more voting restrictions in 2017 than they did in 2016 and 2015 combined. Let me repeat that. Republican-controlled state houses have already passed more voting restrictions in 2017 than the previous 2 years combined. This is not getting any better, it's getting much worse. So continuing, the article says its impact was particularly acute in Milwaukee, where nearly 2/3 of the state's African Americans live, 37% of them below the poverty line. Milwaukee is the most segregated city in the nation, divided between low-income black areas and middle-class white ones. Milwaukee is also the city where some of you already know Sheriff David Clark used to be. I mean, he's not there anymore, thank God. But yeah, that's where he was wreaking havoc on the local black population and the most segregated city in the nation. Then the article continues, it was known as the, quote, Selma of the North in the 1960s because of fierce clashes over desegregation. George Wallace himself once said that if he had to leave Alabama, quote, I want to live in the south side of Milwaukee. I don't know if he really talked like that, but. And then Neil Albrecht, Milwaukee's election director, believes that the voter ID law and other changes passed by the Republican legislature contributed significantly to low turnout. Albrecht is 55 but seems younger. And then, he goes into how Albrecht looks. It's not really important. Then he continues, Ari Berman continues in the article, at his office in City Hall with views of the Milwaukee River, Albrecht showed me a color-coded map of the city's districts, pointing out the ones where turnout had declined the most, including Andrea Anthony's. Next to his desk was a poster that listed, quote, acceptable forms of photo ID. Now he's quoting Albrecht here, the Milwaukee election director. Albrecht says I would estimate that 25 to 35% of the 41,000 decrease in voters, or somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 voters, likely did not vote due to the photo ID requirement, end quote. Then he said later, it is very probable that between the photo ID law and the changes to voter registration, enough people were prevented from voting to have changed the outcome of the presidential election in Wisconsin. Again, activist groups aren't saying this. Okay, this is Milwaukee's own election director who believes voter ID played a direct role in the outcome in Wisconsin. It's not me saying this, it's a man who has direct knowledge of what went on leading up to the election and on election day itself. Don't take my word for it. Continuing, a post-election study by Priorities USA, a Democratic super PAC that supported Clinton, found that in 2016, turnout decreased by 1.7% in the 3 states that adopted stricter voter ID laws, but increased by 1.3% in states where voter ID laws did not change. So turnout decreased in states where stricter ID laws were adopted, but turnout increased by 1.3% in states where ID laws did not change. Wisconsin's turnout dropped 3.3%. Okay, so that's huge in the larger scheme of things. If Wisconsin had the same turnout increase as states whose laws stayed the same, so if Wisconsin had a 1.3% increase, the study says, quote, we estimate that over 200,000 more voters would have voted in Wisconsin in 2016. These, quote, lost voters, those who voted in 2012 and 2014 but not 2016, skewed more African American and more Democrat, end quote, than the overall voting population. Some academics criticized the study's methodology, but its conclusions were consistent with a report from the Government Accountability Office, which found that strict voter ID laws in Kansas and Tennessee had decreased turnout by roughly 2 to 3%, with the largest drops among Black, young, and new voters. So this is something that is consistently happening state after state after state. States that adopted stricter ID laws saw lower turnout in Black and brown areas. This is not rocket science. Okay, this is something that is consistently happening across the country. Wisconsin saw a 3.3% drop. According to a comprehensive study by MIT political science scientist Charles Stewart, get this, this might be one of the most important quotes in the entire article. An estimated 16 million people, some 12% of all voters, encountered at least one problem voting in 2016. There are more than 1 million lost votes, Stewart estimates, because people ran into things like ID laws, long lines at the polls, and difficulty registering. Trump won the election by a total of 78,000 votes in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Wow. Like, that is incredible. The sheer numbers of people who were impacted by voter suppression is astronomical. And yes, you were talking way more than enough people to be who were affected to be able to swing the election in favor of Trump. Way more people were affected who if they had not faced voter suppression tactics, we would have a different president right now. In Wisconsin, the intent of those who pushed for the ID law was clear. On the night of Wisconsin's 2016 primary, GOP Representative Glenn Grothman, a backer of the law when he was in the state Senate, predicted that a Republican would carry the state in November, even though Wisconsin had gone to Barack Obama by 7 points in 2012. He said, quote, "I think Hillary Clinton is the weakest candidate the Democrats ever put up," end quote. And, that's not totally inaccurate. But then he said, he told this to a local TV news reporter, but then he says, get this, he slipped up. He says, "And now we have photo ID. And I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well." I watched that video. That video is still online. He kind of says that offhand, and that shows you these Republicans knew that the ID laws were going to help them. They knew the ID laws were going to suppress the vote, even though, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton was a weak candidate, they knew that they needed even more than that. They couldn't depend on that. They needed to tip the scales in their favor, and these ID laws actually did that. But then they're not supposed to admit that in the public. They're supposed to play stupid, and they're supposed to play up the whole voter fraud BS as an explanation for why these laws are being passed. So he shouldn't have really said that. But he kind of let the cat out of the bag. The article continues, "The strategy worked. While we'll never really know precisely how many people were prevented from voting, it's safe to say that thousands of Wisconsinites like Anthony were denied one of their most fundamental rights. And with Republicans now in control of both the executive and legislative branches in the federal government and a majority of states, that problem will likely get worse." Like I said earlier, there are actual numbers and data based on studies showing an estimate of how many people were faced with voting problems. 16 million people, or 12% of all voters, encountering voting problems that range from long lines that stretch for hours due to the systematic closing of polling stations in Democratic areas to voter ID laws is not all that democratic. It just isn't. And then you add in the fact that Trump won 3 swing states combined by only 78,000 votes. You begin to see the larger picture. You begin to see how this election was stolen, and they were laying the groundwork for this takeover while Obama was in office. The shameful part has been the complete silence from the Democratic Party on this issue, both while Obama sat in office and this was going on right up under his nose, and now even after the 2016 election and the information is coming out, and there is still a deafening silence on the issue of voter suppression. Understand, folks, you don't get more democratic than the right to vote. While everyone spends hours of the day uploading hours of content on YouTube about the First and Second Amendments, spending hours on social media caping for Richard Spencer's free speech, a man who says he doesn't believe in the Constitution and doesn't believe in equal rights, while that goes on, the greatest subversion of our democracy is happening and barely anyone talks about it because the victims are primarily black and brown and help maintain white control over the electorate. Yes, the First Amendment is very crucial to maintaining democracy. You need to be able to voice your grievances without the threat of being silenced by the state. However, I'd rank the right to vote slightly higher. Why? Because even with tighter controls on hate speech, number one, we know hate speech is not valid, but most importantly, we know number two, those people can still vote. They can still cast their voice. They can still have their voices heard in the electoral process. You can't do that in the reverse. You can't stifle the ability to vote and make it harder for upwards of 16 million people to have their voices heard and still maintain a functioning democracy. Voter suppression by its very nature is an affront to democracy. It attacks it at its most basic understanding of what democracy is, 100 times more so than stifling hate speech of neo-Nazis and fascists will ever do. Just because we don't want to hear white supremacist rhetoric doesn't mean they should not have voting rights. So that's why I knew I had to make this video. We are in desperate need of contextualizing the abstract threat posed to democracy outside of just the First and Second Amendments. So let's continue. I know this video is long, but bear with me because people need to hear this. This is America 2017, people, not 1920, not 1950, not the Jim Crow era. It is now. It is happening now. Continuing, from the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to the election of our first black president in 2008, the United States saw a gradual increase in voting access. Wisconsin had a particularly proud history of high voter turnout and expensive voting laws, adopting pioneering measures like election day registration in the 1970s. But when Republicans took control of 26 state legislatures in the wave election of 2010, which was the midterm election, they passed a slew of laws making it harder to vote. 22 states have adopted new voting restrictions since then, more than half of which first went into effect in 2016. Wisconsin followed this pattern after Scott Walker became governor in 2011 and began his crusade to remake the state in the conservative image. One of the first projects he and the GOP legislature undertook was enacting some of the most onerous voting laws in the country. In other states, the rollback of voting protections was aided by the Supreme Court, which in 2013 gutted the Voting Rights Act, ruling that 9 primarily southern states and cities and counties and 6 others with long histories of voter discrimination no longer had to clear new election rules with the federal government. The 2016 election was the first presidential contest in more than 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. A month after the Supreme Court ruling, North Carolina passed a sweeping rewrite of its election laws, requiring voter IDs, cutting early voting, and eliminating same-day registration, among other changes before the law was struck down in a federal court for targeting black voters, with, quote, with almost surgical precision, end quote. Ohio repealed the first week of early voting when African Americans were 5 times likelier than whites to cast a ballot. Florida barred ex-felons from becoming eligible to vote after serving their time preventing 1.7 million Floridians from voting in 2016, including 1 in 6 black voting age residents. Arizona made it a felony for anyone other than a family member or caregiver to collect a voter's absentee ballot, disproportionately hurting Latino and Native American voters in the state's rural areas. So there are a few things I want to break down before continuing. The Florida thing, some people might not be familiar with. So back in 2011, the same year the voter ID law in Wisconsin was being pushed through, Governor Rick Scott of Florida signed off on new clemency rules that rolled back reforms put in place under Jeb Bush and Charlie Crist, the former governors of the same state. So for those that are unaware, the Florida Constitution denies the right to vote for life to anyone with a felony conviction. You can be charged with a felony for anything from driving with a suspended license to trespassing on a construction site to disturbing turtle eggs in their nests. The Florida Constitution basically gives the governor, a political figure, the right to decide who will and won't vote in the next election. Because if people want their rights back, they have to go before a clemency board made up of Rick Scott, the Florida Attorney General, and a few others to appeal for their rights in front of the same people who are organizing this stuff. And so we already know Governor Rick Scott only grants clemency to less than half the people who appeal. So with the new clemency rules in place, here's what it did. People with even non-violent convictions must wait 5 years after they complete all terms of their sentence before even being allowed to apply for restoration of their voting rights. Non-violent convictions, they have to wait 5 years before they get their civil rights back. That's absolutely insane. Okay, this is after they've already served their sentences. Okay, the clock resets if any individual is arrested for even a misdemeanor during that 5-year period, even if no charges are filed. So they don't even have to have charges filed against them. They can just be accused of something, or they can just be arrested of something. Okay, and that whole 5-year period starts over again. This is New Age slavery. Some people must wait 7 years before being able to apply and must appear for a hearing they get to before they even get to the clemency board. I believe those are people who did time for nonviolent drug offenses. I believe they have to wait 7 years. A provision allowing people to apply for a waiver of the rules in place under Bush and Christ were eliminated under the new governor, Rick Scott. So there is no waiver of the rules. You have to stick by this no matter what. Everyone applying for clemency must provide various documents with their application. Bush and Chris had made an exception for those applying for restoration of civil rights. So taking all of this into account, this is why 1.7 million Floridians were disenfranchised from voting in 2016 in Florida. But oh no, voter suppression didn't impact the outcome at all. Not at all. That's what my detractors will say. They'll say, well, Brian, you don't know all of those people would have voted. Look, even if only 10% of that 1.7 million would actually end up voting, that's still 170,000 people conservatively. Y'all do realize that Trump only won Florida by a little over 112,000 votes, right? But oh no, let's not look at voter suppression. There's no way voter suppression had anything to do with why Donald Trump won. Keep making yourselves believe that. Saying Trump won because of voter suppression and not because of turnout is a conspiracy theory to some people. Russia, 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 Hillary Clinton sucks, Russia, Russia, Russia. As the article says, they've been planning this since 2010, folks, when they regained power after the midterms. The 2016 election was the first election without protections from the VRA of 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And look what happened. Millions of people had problems voting across dozens of states. Conservatively, 1 million votes were lost. Conservatively. Cross-check erroneously labeled millions of people double voters by itself. What more needs to be said about this? But I'm going to continue. We're moving into a pre-voting rights era where there isn't any real watchdogging of elections and changes to election laws, Albrecht said. States, including Wisconsin, are making maverick changes that have a significant impact on populations that have been historically disenfranchised. Quote, the GOP shows no sign of letting up on its campaign to restrict voting rights. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has reversed the Obama administration's opposition to a restrictive voter ID law in Texas and voter purging in Ohio, and the request by Trump's Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity for the voter data of every American has led to thousands of voters unregistering in swing states like Colorado and sparked fears that the administration will propose new policies to undermine access to the ballot at the federal and state levels. Emboldened by these efforts, Republican-controlled state houses have already passed more voting restrictions in 2017 than they did in 2016 and 2015 combined. I mentioned that earlier. Taken together, there is no doubt that these election changes affected the turnout among young voters, first-time voters, voters of color, and other members of the Obama coalition that overwhelmingly supported Hillary Clinton, says Mark Elias, a general counsel for Clinton's campaign, who filed a half dozen voting rights lawsuits in the months following the 2016 election. Control of Congress in 2018, not to mention the presidential election of 2020, hinges in part on states like Arizona, Georgia, Indiana, Iowa, New Hampshire, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Virginia, and they don't mention this, but North Carolina as well, and Florida, that have put new voting registrations into place. The lessons, well, I guess that's why they didn't mention North Carolina and Florida, because they might not have new voting restrictions. But the lesson from 2016 is terrifyingly clear. If voter suppression can work in a state like Wisconsin, with a long progressive history and a culture of high civic participation, it can work anywhere. And if those who believe in fair elections don't start to take this threat seriously, history will repeat itself. Pretty self-explanatory, let's continue. I'm going to actually skip down a little bit and summarize a number of paragraphs in the article to save time, because I really want to talk about the role that ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, plays in pushing voter ID laws. ALEC is a far-right group not only behind suspect voter ID laws, but also the infamous Stand Your Ground laws. But before I get into that, though, the article details the story of a woman by the name of Molly McGrath, who is a voting rights advocate who tried to take a black man named Zach Moore, who was from Illinois, to the local DMV to get his voter ID card. He had all of the items he needed to get the voter ID. The DMV even had a sign up that said, quote, "No birth certificate, no problem." And as you might be able to guess, he still wasn't allowed to get his voter ID from the DMV. They told him that he'd have to jump through all of these hoops to be able to vote. But the real issue was that the local DMVs were not following the law. There was a court ruling that was not being followed by at least 11 DMVs, which ended up leading to an investigation. The court ruling deemed that because the voter ID law, the Wisconsin voter ID law, was going through ongoing litigation, the DMV had to provide people like Zach Moore credentials within 6 business days that would have allowed him to still vote. And that didn't happen. The DMVs weren't actually doing that as the court had ordered. So continuing with the article, so when U.S. District Judge James Peterson, who oversaw the implementation of the voter ID law, had found out that Wisconsin's process for issuing IDs was, quote, a wretched failure, end quote, that, quote, has disenfranchised a number of citizens who are unquestionably qualified to vote, end quote, he found out that 85% of those denied IDs by the DMV were black or Latino. The judge noted this in his ruling. 85%. So don't tell me that there's not a racial bias or a racial component to this, to voter suppression. In the trial that Peterson presided over, Todd Albaugh, a former chief of staff for State Senator Dale Schultz, a moderate Republican, described the discussions preceding the law's passage. Now get this. When Republican legislators debated the bill behind closed doors in 2011, this former chief of staff recounted State Senator Mary Lazich, I'm not sure, rose from her chair, smacked the table and said, quote, "We've got to think about what this could mean for the neighborhoods around Milwaukee and the college campuses around the state," end quote. Schultz expressed concern about disenfranchising African Americans and young voters, but Glenn Grothman, who I mentioned earlier, then a state senator and now a member of Congress, cut him off. Grothman said, quote, "What I'm concerned about is winning. We better get this done while we have the opportunity," end quote. That's pretty self-explanatory. These Republicans knew what they were doing. They knew what they were passing. They knew it would disenfranchise the vote. They knew they would suppress the vote. They didn't care. This sounds a lot like what people like when you hear people in the alt-right, like Richard Spencer, say, I don't care about the Constitution. All I want to do is win. I don't care about the law. I want to win. These people sound very similar. They trampled democracy in an effort of winning. They don't care about democracy. They will routinely violate the Constitution. They will break the law. They will pass laws that allow for the suppressing of votes as long as they get to maintain white supremacy and maintain power. That's what it's about at the end of the day. And quotes like this that came out during an investigation, that came out on trial, prove my point. It proves that point. They don't care about upholding the law. They don't care about suppressing the votes of thousands of people and collectively across the nation, millions of people. It's about maintaining their power and their privilege. Albaugh testified that at least 2 other GOP senators were, quote, giddy and, quote, politically frothing at the mouth, end quote, over the 2011 voter ID bill, including State Senator Lee Vukamir, the board chair of the conservative American Legislative Exchange Council, which had helped craft draft voter ID laws in Wisconsin and other states. Taking it away from the article for a second. So we know that since at least 2009, within a year of Obama winning in 2008, Alec has been at the forefront of pushing voter ID laws. They model bills that get sent to conservative legislatures to be submitted into law in states across the country. Not just Alec either, but you also have think tanks like the Heritage Foundation that pushes these policies as well. Now, continuing with the article, after the voter ID law was passed in 2011, the GOP-dominated legislature disbanded the nonpartisan agency. They disbanded the agency tasked with overseeing state elections and educating the public about the law. So why would they, if you're not trying to suppress the vote, why would you disband the nonpartisan agency that's supposed to oversee state elections and educating the public about the law? It's because you don't want oversight. You don't want oversight because you know what you're about to do. Replacing it with a commission of partisan appointees. The legislature didn't allocate any funds for voter ID advertising until June of 2016. Quote, the state did virtually nothing to reach out and educate communities in poverty around the photo ID law, end quote, Albert said. Wisconsin reported that it was running ads about the law in 52 movie theaters across the state, but not one of those was in Milwaukee. Anyway, Albert asked, how often do people in poverty go to the movies? Well, that doesn't mean much. People in poverty a lot of times do go to the movies, but the fact that they didn't even have those advertisements playing in the Milwaukee areas and the areas where black people dominate shows you that there was a bias. It was a very clear bias. They didn't want to affect the white people. They didn't want to affect the white voters. They primarily wanted to disenfranchise the Democratic voters, the black voters, the brown voters. It was very conscious what they did. It was very concerted. It was very organized. Continuing, the voter ID law was one of 33 election changes passed in Wisconsin after Walker took office, and it dovetailed with his signature push to dismantle union, taking away his opponent's most effective organizing tool. Wisconsin's legislature cut early voting from 30 days to 12 days, reduced early voting hours on nights and weekends, and restricted early voting to one location per county. Early voting, one location per county, that's insane. Hampering voters in large urban areas and sprawling rural ones. It also added new residency requirements for voter registration, eliminated staffers who led statewide registration drives, and made it harder to count absentee ballots. Republicans were explicit about the purpose of these changes as well. On the floor of the state Senate, Grothman, who was cheerleading the voter ID law behind closed doors, saying that we need to use this opportunity. He said on the state Senate floor, in reference to extended early voting hours in heavily Democratic cities like Madison and Milwaukee, he said, quote, I want to nip this in the bud before too many other cities get on board. He said he wanted to nip early voting in the bud in the black and brown voting areas. And then there's a parentheses thing here. Roughly 514,000 Wisconsinites voted early in 2012. They favored Obama over Mitt Romney 58 to 41%, according to exit polls. The county clerk of conservative Waukesha County said early voting gave, quote, too much access to voters in Milwaukee and Madison. So you have these right-wingers in Wisconsin who are deliberately coming out and saying, no, we need to stifle the vote in these black and brown areas. We need to do it deliberately. We need to go out of our way to do it, and we're not going to do it for voters in our areas who vote Republican. This was organized voter suppression on a massive scale statewide. Judge Peterson later ruled the early voting cuts had been passed, quote, to suppress the reliably Democratic vote of Milwaukee's African Americans, end quote. The Wisconsin experience, Peterson said, quoted, demonstrates that a preoccupation with mostly phantom election fraud leads to real incidents of disenfranchisement. which undermine rather than enhance confidence in elections, particularly in minority communities, end quote. Now, there's a little bit more to the article, but I think this is a good place to end it. Taking everything into account that I have brought to your attention and based on the information that has come forward from studies not even detailed in this video, confirming what has already been said, I think there is more than enough evidence to build an argument. Voter suppression gave Donald Trump the victory in Wisconsin, definitely, and more than likely the entire 2016 election. In the study I mentioned earlier from Priorities USA, they quoted the Washington Post, which said that before 2006, get this, no state required a photo ID to vote before 2006. Today, 10 states do. 33 states total have some version of voter identification or suppressing rules on the books. 33 states. Now, before I end this video, I want to discuss an argument that I've seen made on more than one occasion. There's a mindset out there that voting is not something that people should worry about partaking in. To a degree, I understand where the sentiment comes from. It stems from a frustration with the Democratic Party that has not held its end of the bargain for far too long when dealing with black issues. Worse, the Democrats have actively participated in policies that have done an incredible amount of damage to communities of color. For a number of years, they were able to get away with it, and after the election of Barack Obama, it appeared to all make sense. Then Donald Trump happened, and I think going forward, a lot of people who fell asleep under Obama and had a false sense of victory are now seeing that the old battles that they thought they could pat themselves in the back about for decades are now coming back and rearing their ugly heads, and people don't know how to interpret the problem. You see, voting rights has often been depicted as a historical struggle that our nation overcame after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. So to a lot of people, serious, organized, and conscious voter suppression isn't supposed to be a thing anymore. The problem is some of the same people who were against voting rights back then are still around today. They've been wanting to attack voting rights since 1965, and they have done that. But recently, since 2009, 2010, it has been ratcheted up on a scale that could literally take this country back to a voting process akin to the Jim Crow era. It is very important that people understand what's at stake right now. The last video I did mention COINTELPRO 2.0 with that silly BIE report. Well, this is Jim Crow voting 2.0. And if people don't take this seriously and make it the major issue it is, we won't have what's left of American democracy anymore. Notice I said what's left because American democracy is already in shambles. We're just fighting to maintain what's left of it. However, if voting rights goes, what's left of our democracy goes along with it. We cannot have a democracy if tens of millions of people are hindered from voting on election day. Anyone who tries to tell you that's somehow democratic is selling you snake oil. With voter suppression tactics becoming the norm nationwide, in the very near future, we could truly be living in a tyranny of the majority.